The gentle hum of the rusty comet's engine had been Alex Al Rider's lullaby for the past 7 years. It wasn't much, a retrofitted Type-C cargo hauler with more patches than original hull, but it was his, and it made him a living. Not a great living, but enough to keep fuel in the tanks and protein packs in the galley. Today's job was like 100 before it, hauling processed mineral supplements from the mining outpost on Ganymede to the agricultural domes on Europa. Boring, but it paid. Al sipped his synthetic coffee, grimacing at the stale taste as he studied the NAV charts. Transit time, 6 hours, 23 minutes at standard approach. The ship's AI announced in its perpetually bored tone. Al drummed his fingers on the console. 6 hours was a lot of nothing to look forward to. His eyes drifted to an unexplored sector just off the standard route. A patch of space that looked empty but lacked the detailed scanning most commercial routes had. "Hey, Rust, what if we cut through Sector ZX for 19? He asked, knowing full well the AI would disapprove. Sector ZX 419 is not fully mapped. Recommended course is... Yeah. I'll interrupted. But what's the time savings if we go through it? A pause. Approximately 1 hour, 47 minutes. However, unmapped sectors carry risks including... Perfect. Update course. Al grinned, already feeling better about his day. The Europa run paid the same regardless of time spent. So shaving nearly 2 hours off meant more downtime at journey's end, his favorite bar on Europa. Maybe he'd even have time for a game of Stellar Drift with old Yuri. Course adjustment confirmed. Warning. Entering unmapped space in 15 minutes. Al stretched in his captain's chair, which was really just a salvaged pilot seat from a decommissioned shuttle. Sometimes you gotta take the road, less traveled, Rust. This is not a philosophical discussion, Captain. This is a navigation concern. You really need a humor upgrade, Al muttered. Exactly 13 minutes later, the rusty comet crossed the invisible boundary into Sector ZX 419. At first, everything seemed normal, just the endless black of space dotted with distant stars. Al relaxed, feet up on the console, mentally counting his extra drinking money. Then, without warning, the ship shuddered. The lights flickered, and the console displays began glitching with multicolored static. Rushed. Status report. Al called out, swinging his feet down and sitting upright. The AI's voice came back distorted. Known inner, GY fluctua tiens. Sys, Thames malfunction, ing. Disengage autopilot. I'm taking manual control. Al grabbed the flight stick, but it was unresponsive in his hands. The engines were still running. He could feel their vibration through the floor, but the ship wasn't responding to commands. The rusty comet began to drift, pulled by some invisible force toward a strange purple nebula that definitely hadn't been on any of the charts. The swirling violet mass seemed to pulse, almost like it was breathing. Rust, full reverse thrusters. Al shouted, flipping emergency override switches. Drus, there's not respawn, ding. Unknown force affecting. The AI cut out completely as the ship's lights died, leaving only the emergency strips glowing a dull red. The main view screen continued functioning, giving Al a perfect view of the purple nebula growing larger as they approached. Perfect, Al said to the empty bridge. This is what I get for trying to save time. If we explode, I'm definitely leaving a 1-star review for whoever mapped this sector. He worked frantically at the controls, trying anything to regain control of his ship. Nothing responded. It was as if the rusty comet had become a ghost ship, all systems functional but completely unresponsive to commands. Come on, you overpriced scrap heap, Al muttered as he tried rerouting power through secondary systems. We've been through worse than this. Remember that time on Titan when the fuel processor exploded? The ship offered no reply as it continued its inexorable journey toward the violet nebula. As they drew closer, Al realized it wasn't exactly a nebula. It was something different. The purple haze seemed to bend around something enormous, but nearly invisible, like a massive structure hidden behind a thin veil of colored fog. What the hell is that? He whispered. The rusty comet passed through the outer layer of the purple haze. Al tensed, expecting violent turbulence or worse. But instead, the ship moved smoothly through, like passing through a soap bubble. When they emerged on the other side, he gasped. Hanging in space before him was what could only be described as a vast crystalline web. It resembled an intricate coral reef made of translucent, faintly glowing material that branched out for kilometers in every direction. Parts of it pulsed with soft light that shifted between pastel colors. It was beautiful, alien, and utterly impossible according to everything Al knew about space. The ship's sensors, which had been going haywire, now displayed readings that made no sense at all. Energy signatures that didn't match any known pattern, materials that shouldn't exist, and spatial dimensions that seemed to fold in on themselves. Rushed, any idea what we're looking at? Al asked, forgetting momentarily that the AI was offline. To his surprise, the communications panel lit up, but not with standard indicators. Instead, a wave of colors washed across it, forming patterns that shifted and changed. Al felt a strange pressure in his head, like the beginning of a headache, but without pain. Images began to form in his mind. A welcome, curiosity, concern. What the? Al pressed his hands to his temples, trying to make sense of what was happening. The images weren't coming from his own imagination. Something, or someone, was placing them directly into his consciousness. More images flooded in. His ship passing through a protective barrier, systems temporarily disabled for safety, reassurance that harm was not intended. Hello, Al said uncertainly. If anyone's listening, I'm Captain Alex Ryder of the independent cargo vessel, the Rusty Comet. Seem to have gotten a bit lost. The communication panel shifted again, colors swirling more intensely. In his mind, Al saw a figure, humanoid but clearly not human. Tall and slender with skin that seemed to glow softly from within, large eyes without pupils and delicate features. The figure made a welcoming gesture. Al hesitated, then tried his ship's standard communication protocols. This is Captain Ryder requesting assistance. My ship has been disabled by unknown forces. Do you copy? The mental images continued, becoming more complex. Al received impressions of a place called the Silent Zone, a hidden region protected from outside detection. His ship had accidentally penetrated the outer defenses, triggering an automatic response that had temporarily disabled his systems. The damage was reparable, but not with his technology alone. So you're saying my ship is damaged, and I can't fix it myself? Al asked, trying to translate the abstract concepts into something concrete. Affirmation, then an offer. Help to repair his ship, but it would require him to come to home, the place where the entity and others like her lived. The repair technology couldn't be brought outside the Silent Zone. Al frowned. In his years of independent hauling, he'd heard plenty of stories about space pirates luring ships into traps with false distress signals or promises of assistance. But this was different. He was already trapped, and whatever technology these beings possessed was far beyond anything pirates would have. Look, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not exactly in the habit of going home with strangers, Al said, trying to inject some humor into the situation. Maybe you could just give me a little push back the way I came, and we'll call it even? The mental images shifted to show his ship's damaged systems in detail. Not just the temporary disruption of controls, but actual physical damage to delicate components that regulated the ship's spatial positioning. Without repairs, the Rusty Comet would drift aimlessly if it left the Silent Zone, unable to maintain a stable course. Great. Just great. I'll rub his face with both hands. So my options are to accept your invitation or become space debris. Not much of a choice, is it? A sense of regret came through the mental link, followed by reassurance. No harm was intended. Help was genuine. Al looked around his ship, his home for the last 7 years, now dead in space. He thought about the cargo in his hold, the delivery deadline he'd now definitely miss, and the complete absence of any other options. Well, he said finally, at least this will make one hell of a story at Journey's End. If I ever get back there. Agreement and what felt like amusement filtered through the mental link. Then instructions. Prepare for transport. Transport? What do you mean by? Before Al could finish his question, A soft blue light surrounded the rusty comet. It wasn't a tractor beam as he understood them. There was no sensation of being pulled. Instead, it felt as if space itself was folding around the ship, bringing destination and origin together like pinching the opposite edges of a sheet of paper. The sensation lasted only a moment. When it ended, the rusty comet was inside the crystal structure, floating in a vast open space that resembled a docking bay. Surrounding the ship were several of the beings El had seen in his mind. Tall, slender figures with luminescent skin that shifted colors subtly as they moved. One approached the ship, stopping at what would be the main airlock. Al hesitated, then initiated the docking procedure, cycling the air and opening the outer door. Standing, there was the entity from the mental image, tall, with an almost ethereal grace. Up close, Al could see that what he'd taken for clothing was actually patterns of slightly different colored luminescence on their skin, forming intricate designs that shifted subtly. The being's face was almost human-like, but with larger eyes that had no visible pupils, just iridescent orbs that seemed to change color with subtle mood shifts. Hello, Al said awkwardly. I'm Al. Thanks for the invitation. The being tilted its head slightly, and Al felt rather than heard a response in his mind. A name, or something like a name, that his human brain interpreted as Kalen. Kalen, he repeated, testing the sound. Nice to meet you. So about my ship. Kalen made a gesture with a slender hand, and Al sensed that he should follow. He hesitated, looking back at his ship. I should probably shut down the remaining systems first, and grab a few things. Understanding flowed through the mental link. Al quickly moved through his ship, powering down critical systems and grabbing his personal emergency kit, a habit from years of uncertain ports and questionable clients. It contained basic survival gear, some credit chips, and a small neural stunner that was probably useless against whatever technology these beings possessed, but it made him feel better to have it. When he emerged from the ship, Kalen was waiting patiently. Al followed as they walked away from the docking area and got his first real look at home. It wasn't a planet. It wasn't a space station. It was... Al struggled to find appropriate words, even in his own mind. They were inside what appeared to be a massive biological mechanical construct, a city grown rather than built. Towering structures resembled coral formations or crystal growths, but they pulsed with life and light. Gardens floated in midair, plants unlike anything Al had seen before, glowing with bioluminescence in blues, purples, and pinks. Between the structures flowed what looked like rivers of pure energy, pulsing like arteries through the city. Most shocking was the silence. Despite seeing dozens, perhaps hundreds of the luminescent beings moving about, there was almost no sound, no machinery humming, no footsteps echoing, no voices calling out. After years on noisy space stations and in the perpetually buzzing confines of his ship, the quiet was almost deafening. This is not what I was expecting, Al said, his voice sounding jarringly loud in the silence. Kalen turned, and Al received an impression of curiosity. What had he expected? I don't know. A planet? A space station? Not. He gestured broadly. This. They continued walking, or rather floating slightly above the surface along invisible currents. Al noticed sections that resembled massive museum galleries, filled with objects that seemed out of place, some recognizably human-made from different eras, others completely alien. There were artifacts that looked like ancient Earth items next to technology so advanced he couldn't begin to guess its purpose. Are you collectors? He asked. Kalen's response filtered into his mind. Keepers. Before Al could ask what that meant, they arrived at what appeared to be a living space. A room formed from the same crystalline material as the rest of the structure, but somehow more enclosed and private. Inside were objects that might generously be interpreted as furniture, surfaces for sitting or reclining, though they looked grown rather than constructed. Kalen gestured to a surface, and Al understood he was being invited to rest. As he sat, a small sphere of glowing blue gel floated toward him, hovering at hand height. Is this food? He asked uncertainly. Affirmation came through the mental link. along with assurance of compatibility with human physiology. Cautiously, Al touched the gel. It was cool and slightly firm, like a water balloon. When he pressed harder, a small piece separated from the main mass. Gathering his courage, he put it in his mouth. The experience was unlike anything he'd ever eaten. It wasn't just flavor, though that was present, something like mint and berries and something undefinable, but also emotion. The food somehow conveyed feelings of welcome and curiosity. "That's different," Al said after swallowing. "Does all your food taste like feelings?" Amusement filtered through the link, followed by complex concepts that Al interpreted as food being both sustenance and communication, nourishment for body and connection. "Right, of course." Al nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "So about my ship repairs." Kalen conveyed that the process had already begun. Small autonomous repair units, which Al briefly glimpsed as tiny, insect-like mechanisms, were assessing and beginning work on the rusty comet. The process would take time, perhaps a full rotation cycle by AL's reckoning. A day? That's impressive. Repair yards back home would take a week for that kind of work. As Kalen began showing Al more of home, he noticed recurring symbols etched into walls and objects. Throughout the city, some seemed vaguely familiar, resembling ancient Earth glyphs or mathematical formulas. Others were completely alien, but appeared repeatedly in what must be significant locations. When Al asked about them, Kalen's response was vague. Impressions of history, preservation, purpose. Nothing concrete enough for Al to fully understand. The tour continued with what seemed like a transportation system. Giant leaf-like platforms that glided along the rivers of energy, carrying lumina, as Al had learned they called themselves, from one part of the vast city to another. Al and Kalen boarded one, and Al experienced the strange sensation of floating along currents of pure energy with nothing but a thin organic platform between him and the flow. "This beats subway systems back home," Al commented as they glided past structures of impossible beauty, some resembling massive flowering plants made of crystal, others like abstract sculptures that changed form as he watched. He noticed that the lumina they passed would change the color patterns on their skin when near each other, creating rippling waves of light that passed between them. Occasionally, one would look at Al with obvious curiosity, their skin briefly flashing with patterns of interest before politely looking away. "I'm guessing you don't get many visitors," Al said to Kalen. The response was complex, impressions of isolation, protection, purpose. The silent zone was hidden for reasons. Visitors were rare. Observation was the norm rather than interaction. As they traveled deeper into the city, Al began noticing more areas that resembled museums or archives. Some contained what appeared to be technology from various civilizations, including items that looked distinctly human. Ancient navigation equipment, early spacesuit designs, even what appeared to be parts from ships that matched historical photos Al had seen of early exploration vessels that had disappeared without trace centuries ago. "These are from Earth," Al said, stopping to stare at what was unmistakably a component from the famous lost ship Beagle 4, which had vanished during the first extrasolar colonization attempts. "How did you get these?" Kalen's response was evasive, but Al caught impressions of collection, preservation, observation. An uncomfortable thought began forming in AL's mind. "Have you been watching us? Watching Earth?" Before Kalen could respond, they arrived at another section of the city. This area felt different, more structured, more purposeful. The architecture was less organic and more deliberate, with obvious security measures in place. Al noticed what might be defense systems integrated into the walls, though so advanced they barely resembled weapons as he understood them. Kalen led him to a viewing platform overlooking a vast spherical chamber. Inside the chamber were thousands, perhaps millions, of small glowing orbs, each a different color, suspended in a complex three-dimensional pattern that slowly rotated. At the center was a larger orb, pulsing with white light that occasionally sent out tendrils connecting to the smaller orbs. "What is this place?" Al asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The answer came not just from Kalen, but seemed to emanate from the chamber itself, flooding Al's mind with images and concepts almost too vast to comprehend. Home was not just a city. It was a library, a cosmic archive created by an ancient race known only as the Architects. Its purpose was to collect, preserve, and protect knowledge, biological samples, and even conscious impressions from thousands of civilizations across the galaxy that had risen, flourished, and ultimately disappeared, either through self-destruction, natural disaster, or the natural entropy of time. The Lumina were not the architects. They were caretakers, possibly created or evolved specifically to maintain the library after the architects had either transcended to another plane of existence or died out eons ago. Their luminescent skin, telepathic abilities, and symbiotic relationship with the library itself were all adaptations for their purpose. Earth was just one of many worlds under observation, not with any malicious intent, but as part of the grand project of preservation. The artifacts from human history weren't stolen, but rescued from destruction, collected at moments when they would otherwise have been lost forever. Most shockingly, some of the glowing orbs contained not just information, but preserved consciousness, the minds, memories, and experiences of individuals from lost civilizations, maintained in a kind of stasis, neither truly alive nor dead. Al staggered back from the viewing platform, overwhelmed by the scale and implications of what he was seeing. I can't even. Kalen placed a gentle hand on Al's shoulder, the first physical contact between them. A sense of calm flowed from the touch, helping Al process the flood of information. So you're, like, cosmic librarians? Preserving everything that would otherwise be lost? Al asked once he'd recovered somewhat. Affirmation, along with additional context. The library existed not just to preserve, but to prevent the same patterns of destruction from repeating endlessly. Knowledge was collected to be shared. Eventually, when civilizations reached a point where they could use it wisely. And humans aren't at that point yet. I'm guessing, Al said with a wry smile. Kalen's response was diplomatic but clear. Not yet, but promising progress. Al's natural curiosity drew him to explore more of this section. Despite Kalen's subtle attempts to guide him elsewhere, he wandered down a corridor lined with what appeared to be individual study chambers, each containing different artifacts or displays. One chamber caught his attention. Inside was what looked like a three-dimensional model of Earth's solar system, but with strange anomalies. I'll step closer to the entrance, trying to see better. What's wrong with this model? That's not how Jupiter's moons are arranged. Kalen sent urgent warnings, but they came too late. Al had already crossed the threshold into the chamber. Immediately, the display changed, expanding rapidly to fill the room with a holographic representation of not just the solar system, but what appeared to be timeline projections, probability matrices, and intervention scenarios. Alarm rippled through Kalen's mental communication as systems throughout the chamber activated, responding to Al's unauthorized presence. The door sealed shut behind them, and the holographic display intensified, becoming almost solid around them. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, Al began, but was cut off as the chamber's systems fully engaged. What happened next was chaotic. The holographic display seemed to attempt to interface directly with Al's mind, but unlike the gentle telepathic communication of the Lumina, this was overwhelming and invasive. Images of Earth's possible futures flashed before him, some peaceful, others devastating. He saw climate collapse, recovery, war, transcendence, extinction, all simultaneously as if the chamber was showing every possible timeline at once. Al fell to his knees, hands pressed to his temples. Through the overwhelming flood of information, he became dimly aware of Kalen and several other Lumina outside the chamber, their skin flashing in urgent patterns as they worked to override the systems. With a sudden clarity breaking through the chaos, Al realized what was happening. The chamber was designed for Lumina consciousness, able to process multiple information streams simultaneously. His human mind couldn't handle it. But perhaps that limitation was also an advantage. Rather than trying to process everything at once, Al focused on a single element of the system, the control interface at the center of the room, which resembled a crystalline pedestal. Forcing himself to his feet, he staggered toward it. "Simple is sometimes better," he muttered, reaching out to press his hand directly against the pedestal's surface. Instead of trying to interface mentally as Illumina would, he relied on the most basic interaction, physical touch. To his surprise, the system responded. The overwhelming flood of information paused, then reconfigured, becoming more linear and comprehensible. The door to the chamber slid open, and Kalen rushed in, skin flashing patterns of concern and relief. Other Lumina followed, their movements conveying urgency as they worked to properly shut down the chamber systems. I'll step back, leaning against the wall as the holographic display gradually faded. "Sorry about that," he said weakly. "I've always been too curious for my own good." Kalen's response carried concern, but also unexpected respect. The chamber was an ancient probability mapping system, rarely used even by Lumina due to its overwhelming complexity. Yet Al, with his simple human approach, had managed to calm it when their more sophisticated methods were struggling. As they left the restricted area, returning to the more public spaces of the library, Al found himself processing everything he'd learned. This wasn't just a chance encounter or a random navigation error. He had stumbled upon perhaps the greatest repository of knowledge in the galaxy, a place that preserved the legacy of countless civilizations, including his own. The idea was simultaneously humbling and exhilarating. All the mysteries of lost human expeditions, vanished colonies, and unexplained artifacts throughout human history suddenly had a potential explanation. They hadn't all been destroyed or fallen into black holes. Some had been collected, preserved here in this cosmic library. By the time they returned to the docking area, Al was surprised to find the rusty comet completely repaired. Not only that, but it looked better than it had in years, perhaps better than when it was new. The hull gleamed, all patch marks seamlessly integrated. The energy signature reading on his portable scanner showed improvements in efficiency that should have been impossible with the ship's original design. Kalen confirmed what the reading suggested. The repair units hadn't just fixed the damage, but had made subtle improvements, integrating compatible library technology where possible. The ship would be faster, more efficient, and more durable than before. Al ran a hand along the hull, feeling the perfect smoothness where once there had been welding seams and repair patches. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "Thank you." Now came the moment of decision. The ship was ready. Al could leave, return to his familiar life of cargo runs and space station bars. But after what he'd seen, could he really go back to that existence? And if he did, what would he tell people about where he'd been? Kalen seemed to sense his internal conflict. The luminous skin patterns shifted to a gentle, questioning pattern. "I don't know what to do," Al admitted. "If I go back and tell anyone about this place, they'll either think I'm crazy or worse. They'll believe me and want to find it. And I'm guessing most humans aren't ready for what's here." Agreement flowed through their mental link. The library remained hidden for good reasons. Civilizations that weren't ready for its knowledge often misused it, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. But if I don't tell anyone, I'll be carrying this secret alone. And there's so much here that could help people, help Earth. Kalen's response was thoughtful. There might be a third option. Throughout the library's history, there had occasionally been individuals who served as intermediaries, beings who knew of the library's existence but shared only specific knowledge when appropriate, guiding their civilizations subtly toward readiness. "You're offering me a job?" Al asked, surprised. "As some kind of cosmic courier?" Amusement colored the mental impression. "Not exactly a job, more of a connection, a relationship of mutual benefit." Al would return to his life, but with occasional contact from the library, perhaps bringing him back when appropriate or providing him with specific information that humanity was ready to receive. Al looked at his ship, then back at the vast crystal city behind him. The decision seemed both monumental and surprisingly easy. "I've always been good at finding shortcuts," he said with a small smile. Maybe getting lost this time was the biggest shortcut of all. They spent the next few hours discussing details. Al would receive subtle modifications to his ship's communication system, allowing secure contact with the library. He would be able to return on his own, without needing to accidentally stumble through the protective barrier again. And he would carry with him a small crystal, a data storage device containing information the Lumina had deemed appropriate for current human development. Sustainable energy improvements, medical advances, and historical knowledge about Earth's past that had been lost over time. As Al prepared to board his ship, Kalen accompanied him to the airlock. For a moment, they stood in silence, two beings from vastly different origins who had, somehow, formed a connection. "I'm still not entirely sure this isn't all an elaborate hallucination," Al said. "Maybe I hit my head when the ship malfunctioned, and I'm actually floating unconscious in space right now." Kalen's skin rippled with what Al now recognized as their version of laughter. The mental impression was clear. Reality often exceeded imagination. Before boarding, Al had one last question. "Will I remember everything? Or will you, I don't know, wipe my memory of the restricted areas?" The answer surprised him. Memory alteration was possible, but considered a violation of consciousness. One of the core principles of the library was preservation, not alteration. Al would remember everything, but the crystal he carried would help him understand what should remain private and what could be shared. With a final farewell, Al boarded the Rusty Comet. The systems came online instantly, more responsive than ever before. The ship hummed with energy, as if eager to fly again. As the airlock sealed and the ship prepared to depart, Al took one last look through the viewport at Kalen and the incredible crystalline city beyond. He wasn't leaving forever, he reminded himself. This was just the beginning of something new. The blue light enveloped the ship once more, and space folded around it. In an instant, the Rusty Comet was back in normal space, just outside the purple nebula that marked the entrance to the Silent Zone. Al sat quietly for a moment, then checked his chronometer. Despite everything he'd experienced, only 6 hours had passed in normal space-time, less than his original planned journey would have taken. With a smile, he set course for Europa. He still had a cargo to deliver, after all. And after that, well, the universe had suddenly become a much larger and more interesting place. Al leaned back in his captain's chair, fingering the small crystal in his pocket. "Sometimes," he said to his ship, which seemed to listen with new attentiveness, "getting lost is the only way to find something worth finding." The Rusty Comet accelerated smoothly into the darkness, carrying its cargo of minerals, its captain, and secrets that would change everything.